When you think of Mexico, what comes to mind? Aztec pyramids rising from the valleys. Mayan temples hidden in the jungle. Colorful traditions, mariachi music, vibrant food. But beneath all of that is something you can't see, a story written in DNA. Mexico's people carry one of the most fascinating genetic legacies in the world. A mix of ancient civilizations that lived here for thousands of years, waves of Spanish colonists and African slaves who arrived during conquest and empire, and more recent migrations from Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. And that's exactly what this video is about, the genetic makeup of Mexico. So what does it really mean to be Mexican? Are Mexicans mostly Aztec? Spanish? A blend of both? Or something far more complex? To answer that, we need to go back, way back, to the very first people who set foot in the land we now call Mexico. The story of Mexico begins long before pyramids and empires. Over 13,000 years ago, the very first humans arrived here, small groups of hunter-gatherers who had crossed from Asia into the Americas during the last ice age. In fact, archaeologists working at Chicwa White Cave in northern Mexico uncovered stone tools they believe are more than 25,000 years old, evidence that humans may have reached Mexico even earlier than once thought. Life for these early settlers was anything but easy. The land was harsh and diverse, deserts in the north, towering mountains in the center, dense jungles in the south. To survive, they hunted mammoths and giant sloths at first. When those animals disappeared, they turned to smaller game, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Then came a discovery that changed everything: farming. Somewhere in the valleys of central and southern Mexico, people began experimenting with wild grasses. Over generations, they transformed a small, tough plant into something extraordinary: maize, corn. Geneticists at the University of California have traced the origins of corn back over 9,000 years to the Balsas River Valley in southern Mexico. This wasn't just a new crop, it was a revolution. Alongside beans and squash, maize became the foundation of life, fueling population growth and laying the foundation for civilization. And here's the most incredible part: the DNA of those very first settlers still runs through Mexico today. Studies published in Science and Nature show that indigenous communities, from the Maya of the Yucatan to the Zapotec of Oaxaca to the Rarámuri of the northern deserts, carry deep ancestry from those Ice Age pioneers. We talk about the first Mexicans, we're not just talking about the past. Their descendants are still here, carrying forward one of humanity's oldest survival stories. Corn had given people the ability to settle, to grow, to thrive. What began as survival soon became ambition. Because once food is secure, humans start reaching for something more: power. And in Mexico, that hunger for power gave birth to civilizations so brilliant, they would shape not just the land, but the very DNA of its people. The first of these great civilizations were the Olmecs, around 3,000 years ago. They lived along the Gulf Coast, and they left behind something unforgettable: massive stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons. Archaeologists believe they were portraits of their rulers, a way of saying, "Here is power, carved in stone." But the Olmecs gave more than statues. Many historians call them the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Their ideas of religion, trade, and even sacred symbols would echo for centuries, influencing every civilization that came after. Then came the Maya. From the Yucatan Peninsula to modern-day Guatemala, they weren't just farmers or builders, they were timekeepers of the universe. Their astronomers tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and planets with astonishing precision. One researcher from the University of Cambridge noted that Maya calendars were more accurate than those used in Europe at the same time. To the Maya, power didn't just come from kings and armies, it came from controlling time itself. And then, much later, rose the most famous of all, the Aztecs. They started as wanderers, exiled tribes searching for a home. Legend says their gods told them to settle where they found an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. That place was a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Out of that swamp, they built Tenochtitlan, one of the greatest cities in the world, with causeways, canals, and temples that stunned Spanish conquistadors when they first arrived. At its peak, the Aztec Empire ruled over millions, demanding tribute from hundreds of towns. Their power was absolute, their empire vast. But empires carry a shadow. The more power you have, the more enemies you make. So when? And here's where genetics enters the story. Each of these civilizations, Olmec, Maya, Aztec, didn't just leave ruins. They left descendants. Modern DNA studies show strong genetic links between today's indigenous groups in Mexico and these ancient empires. The Maya language is still spoken by over 6 million people today. The Nahuatl language of the Aztecs still echoes in Mexican Spanish with words like chocolate, tomato, and coyote. The struggle for survival had created people. The struggle for power had created civilizations. But the stage was now set for the greatest clash of all, because where there is power, there will always be challengers. The Aztecs stood at the height of their power. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a jewel of the world, shimmering temples, vast markets, floating gardens feeding the city. To them, it must have seemed like their empire would last forever. But history has a way of breaking even the mightiest dreams. Because across the ocean, ships were already sailing west, and with them came a new kind of struggle. Not for survival. Not for empire. But for conquest. In 1519, a Spanish adventurer named Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with just a few hundred men. By all logic, they should have been crushed. The Aztec Empire had hundreds of thousands of warriors. Tenochtitlan was larger than almost any European city. And yet, within 2 years, that empire was gone. How? It wasn't just Spanish bravery. It was technology and strategy. The Spaniards carried steel swords, cannons, and horses, weapons and animals the Aztecs had never seen. Cortés also formed key alliances with indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalans, who hated Aztec rule and saw the newcomers as a way to break free. And then came something no one could fight: disease. Smallpox swept through the Aztec population, killing tens of thousands, including their leaders, weakening the empire from within. By 1521, Tenochtitlan had fallen. The Aztec dream was over. But this wasn't just destruction. It was also a creation. Because after the conquest came something entirely new: the mixing of peoples. Spanish men, far from their homeland, took indigenous wives and partners. Over generations, this gave rise to the Mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry. Today, Mestizos make up the largest genetic group in Mexico. A landmark genetic study published in Science found that the average Mexican genome is roughly 50% indigenous and 50% European, though the balance varies by region. In southern states like Oaxaca, indigenous ancestry is dominant. In northern regions, Spanish ancestry is stronger. But this birth of Mestizos was not a story of equality. Colonial society placed Spaniards at the top, indigenous people at the bottom, and everyone else somewhere in between. Yet, despite this hierarchy, their DNA wove together, permanently fusing two worlds. The conquest was brutal. It ended empires. But it also gave rise to the core of modern Mexico, a people forged in the struggle between two worlds. And yet, this was not the end of the story. Because into this fragile new society, another force would soon arrive, one that would change the bloodlines of Mexico once again. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not the end of struggle, it was only the beginning. Spain may have claimed victory, but the land of Mexico did not fall silent. It became a crucible, a place where cultures collided, where identities mixed, and where the dream of freedom slowly took shape. Because while Spain thought it had created a colony, what it really created was a new people, and those people would one day demand their independence. After conquest, the Spanish crown brought more than colonists and missionaries. They also brought slaves from Africa. It's a part of Mexico's story that is often forgotten, but it is crucial. Between the 1500s and 1800s, historians estimate that 200,000 African slaves were brought to New Spain. Many worked in sugar plantations along the coasts, in mines, and in households. But slavery in Mexico was never as rigid as in the U.S. South. Africans escaped, resisted, and blended into indigenous and mestizo populations. One of the most famous figures was Gaspar Yanga, an enslaved African who escaped in the late 1500s and founded a free community in Veracruz. His settlement survived Spanish attacks for decades. By 1618, the Spanish had to recognize it as the first free black town in the Americas. Today, Yanga is celebrated as a national hero, proof that the struggle for freedom ran in Mexico's veins centuries before independence. Genetic studies back this up. Traces of African ancestry are still found in coastal regions like Veracruz, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. A 2020 study published in Nature Communications showed that many Mexicans carry 2 to 5% African DNA, though in some regions it's much higher. This thread of Africa, woven with indigenous and Spanish blood, gave Mexico even greater diversity. But freedom was not just about escaping chains. By the late 1700s, a bigger struggle was coming. Spain's control was weakening. The colony of New Spain was wealthy, vibrant, and full of people who no longer thought of themselves as Spanish. They were mestizos, indigenous, Africans, Creoles, and they wanted a country of their own. In 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo raised the call for rebellion with his famous Grito de Dolores. The War of Independence had begun. It was brutal, stretching for 11 long years. Peasants, indigenous fighters, and freed slaves joined together against Spanish armies. This war was not just political, it was deeply genetic and cultural. For the first time, people of mixed ancestry fought side by side, claiming the right to rule themselves. A 19th-century Mexican historian wrote that the blood of the Indian, the Spaniard, and the African mingled on the battlefield. That was more than metaphor, it was the biological truth of Mexico itself. In 1821, Mexico finally won. The Spanish crown was expelled. A new nation was born. And that nation was not purely Spanish, not purely indigenous, not purely African. It was all of them at once. Mexico was now a country forged from struggle, survival, power, conquest, and finally freedom. A land where DNA carried the scars of battles and the promise of unity. But Mexico's story didn't end with independence. In fact, a new chapter was only just beginning, because the world was opening up, and fresh waves of migration would soon pour into Mexico, leaving their mark on its genetic map. Independence gave Mexico freedom, but freedom did not mean peace. The young nation was fragile, torn between rich and poor, indigenous and Spanish, center and frontier. Mexico had to rebuild itself, not just politically, but genetically. Because history never stops at one mix. New people were coming. New threads would be woven into the fabric of Mexico. And with them came the same eternal struggle, to survive, to adapt, and to stay united. The 19th and 20th centuries brought new migrations, each small compared to the massive indigenous and Spanish foundation, but each leaving a lasting mark. In the north, Chinese laborers arrived in the late 1800s to work in railroads and agriculture. Many settled in Baja California, Sonora, and Sinaloa. They faced discrimination and even massacres, like the tragic Torian Massacre of 1911, where hundreds of Chinese immigrants were killed during the Mexican Revolution. Yet, despite hardship, their communities endured, and today, Chinese ancestry still lingers in families across northern Mexico. In the ports of Veracruz, another wave came, Lebanese and Middle Eastern merchants in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were drawn by trade opportunities, often starting as peddlers and growing into successful entrepreneurs. Their legacy is visible even in food. The famous tacos al pastor were inspired by Lebanese shawarma, blending Middle Eastern cooking with Mexican flavors. genetics followed culture, Middle Eastern DNA entered the Mexican mix. And then there were Europeans and Americans. Some came as miners, some as railroad engineers, some as settlers in sparsely populated regions. While smaller in scale, they added new fragments of ancestry into the Mexican genetic map. But through it all, the foundation never shifted: indigenous plus Spanish. That was the bedrock. Every new wave was a thread, but the tapestry was already vast. So what does science say? Modern genetic studies have given us a detailed picture. A landmark 2014 study published in Science analyzed thousands of genomes across Mexico. The result? The average Mexican today is 40 to 60% indigenous, 30 to 50% European, and smaller traces of African and Asian. But the balance depends on where you look. In southern Mexico, indigenous ancestry can climb as high as 70 to 80%, especially in states like Oaxaca and Chiapas, where indigenous languages are still widely spoken. In northern Mexico, European ancestry is stronger, sometimes over 60%, reflecting both colonial history and proximity to the U.S. On the coasts, especially Veracruz and Guerrero, African ancestry is most visible, both genetically and culturally. This mosaic is what makes Mexico so unique. As Dr. Andrés Moreno, a geneticist from the National Institute of Genomic Medicine, put it in 2016, Mexicans are not one people, but many Mexicos inside one country. And yet, the struggle continues. Because Mexico's identity is not just numbers on a genetic chart, it's a living question. How do you preserve indigenous roots in a world rushing toward modernity? How do you honor African and Asian contributions when history often erases them? How do you celebrate diversity without losing unity? This is the modern survival struggle. Not against deserts, not against empires, not against colonial masters, but against forgetting. Against losing the memory of where Mexico truly came from. And that brings us to the final act, the present. Because Mexico's DNA is not just history, it's alive today, shaping families, culture, and even medicine in ways we're only beginning to understand. The modern story of Mexico is a mosaic of bloodlines and memories, indigenous roots, Spanish conquest, African resistance, Asian migration. Science has mapped the percentages, but DNA is not just numbers. Behind every percentage is a story of survival, of love, of violence, of faith, of children born into a new world. And so, after 30,000 years of struggle, we arrive at the final question, the question that ties all these journeys together. Mexico's genetic makeup cannot be captured in a single word. It's not Aztec. It's not Spanish. It's not even Mestizo in the simple sense. It is, instead, a patchwork of survival stories. Over 13,000 years ago, Ice Age hunters crossed mountains and deserts, leaving behind descendants who still live in indigenous villages today. The Olmecs, Maya, and Aztecs built civilizations, cities, and calendars, leaving their genetic legacy written in the bones of millions. In 1519, Spanish conquistadors arrived, and by 1521, the Aztec Empire had fallen. Yet out of destruction came creation, indigenous and European blood entwined, forming the mestizo heart of modern Mexico. Alongside them came African slaves, who fought, rebelled, and escaped, their DNA now strongest in Mexico's coasts. And later came Chinese workers, Lebanese merchants, European migrants, each a small but visible brushstroke on the canvas. Modern genetics confirms this layered story. A study by the National Institute of Genomic Medicine showed that the average Mexican today carries 40 to 60% indigenous DNA, 30 to 50% European, and smaller traces of African and Asian. But as scientists point out, the numbers are not fixed, they change with geography. In Chiapas, indigenous ancestry dominates. In Sonora, European ancestry rises. In Veracruz and Guerrero, African heritage is strong. Yet, here lies the truth. Mexico is not just genetics. Mexico is a story. It is the story of survival in deserts and jungles. The story of power built in pyramids and empires. the story of conquest and resistance, of freedom won after centuries. The story of identity, forged not in purity, but in mixture. As Dr. David Reich, a Harvard geneticist who has studied Latin American DNA, once said, "Every Mexican is a living history book. Their genome is a map of the past 30,000 years." So what does it mean to be Mexican? It means carrying the resilience of the first hunters. It means holding the creativity of the Maya and the Aztecs. It means surviving conquest, slavery, and revolution.